Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Deceptive Methods, a podcast where we discuss historical conspiracies. And my name is Amanda.
And I am Jesse.
And I have a degree in history, and Jesse does not.
Mm-hmm.
And now this is how we are enjoying history together.
Yes. She is my teacher.
So, and also point out that you don't know what the topic is. So I researched the topic.
I have no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah, I researched the topic and write it all up and try very hard not to tell you what it is.
Mm-hmm. Despite having it open in front of me all the time.
Yeah, and I'm like, don't look at my computer. Okay, so for this episode...
And this is episode number 3.
Yes, third episode. And for the third episode, I thought we would go back to our friends in the delightful world of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a.k.a. the FBN, and drug regulation, specifically for cannabis, a.k.a. the marijuana.
The wacky weedus.
Yeah, the reefer, the ganja.
Devil's lettuce.
Yeah, there's so many.
Mm-hmm.
So to focus on cannabis regulation, you really only have to look to one person, the joyous joy bringer Harry Anslinger.
Harry Asslinger.
So Harry Anslinger was from Altoona, Pennsylvania, born in 1892. And one story that he liked to tell over and over throughout his career was about when he was 12 years old. And when he was 12 years old, he witnessed a neighbor going through opium withdrawal.
Oh.
So he was visiting his neighbors, his adult neighbors for some reason, and he heard screaming upstairs. And her husband asked Harry to go to the drugstore and hurry back as quickly as possible with her prescription. So he races to and from the store, and the husband administers the drug, and then she slowly quiets back down. And when Anslinger tells this story, he states that he was concerned that the morphine was sold to a 12-year-old boy with no questions asked. And on some level, he wants to prevent this from happening in the world. But the question is, did Harry Anslinger think that he was doing good? Was he motivated by pure intentions, his quest against drugs and alcohol? And a lot of that comes up when you're talking about Harry Anslinger is racism. And then people saying, well, you know, everybody was racist. He was just as racist. But somebody who is just as racist as everyone back then is still racist.
Yep.
So you can be just as racist as Tom next door, but that still makes you racist.
Mm-hmm. I do always love it was just, it was a symptom of the time.
Yeah, it was the times. And it's like, okay, but does that make everything better? Is that an excuse?
That doesn't mean he wouldn't be great.
Right.
He would be great today. I mean,
yeah, if we drop good old Harry here, oh my God, he would have a heart attack, first of all. But, I mean, if we dropped him here today, he would still be a racist, you know? So let's start off with talking about the state of narcotics in the world up until 1930, when he was appointed as the commissioner to the FBN. So the world before drug regulation was not like anything we have today. So before the FBN was formed in 1930, there was no restrictions on drugs at all. So every drug you can think of that existed at the time was legal. You could buy them from the drugstore. You could even order them from catalogs, which was like the original Silk Road. Catalogs.
You could get them in your soda.
Yeah. I mean, you could just get them.
Isn't that what most of snake oil was just a bunch of whatever drugs they could find or procure? And
yeah, they would just, it didn't even have to be anything that was
it could be
altering your state. It could just be this guy's pee. So what we think of now as illegal drugs were used in concoctions and branded as medicines.
Health tonics.
Right, like Coca-Cola or Pepsi, or tonics and elixirs with morphine and cannabis. During the 19th century, the United States was a nation of opium users.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Never went away.
No, not even a little bit.
No. It's estimated that 500,000 Americans were addicted to opium by the end of the century. That century. The
I got
19th century.
I'm with you.
And this century.
Yes.
Probably a lot more.
Yeah, probably
obviously.
500 billion. No, that's probably too much.
500 billion. So, like, even children were given opium to, it was.
It got him to stop crying.
Yeah, it calmed and soothed. So, how bad can it be? So the medicines and elixirs didn't list, or they didn't have to list, what the main ingredient was. So before the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, there wasn't any labeling requirements at all. So that's like, there's your snake oil.
Mm-hmm.
But the labeling wasn't enforced fully until 1915, which there was another act that they made to enforce the 1906 act, but actually I'll get to that anyway. So as far as people knowing what they were taking, it didn't really matter that medicines weren't labeled because people knew that they were taking opiates and various drugs. Like, it wasn't necessarily misinformation. That's what they wanted. So it was common for physicians to push drugs on their patients.
Just on them, just
Yeah,
just
at their face, throwing at their face. Stomach. Yeah, but also, still sounds familiar. Like just big pharma telling us what's safe, quote unquote. And it is estimated that doctors accounted for the highest addiction rates at about 2% of any profession. Addiction wasn't thought of as a mental disorder, and drugs weren't considered illicit. They were just the medicines.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, they didn't know full-on germ theory or know what viruses were for most of history, so
it was basically like the Dark Ages back then, unless you lived in like Germany, which they were ahead of the game. So in 1909, the Shanghai Opium Convention was the first multinational drug control initiative, and for the first time there was an overview of the world's drug situation, which was enlightening. So I'm not going to go into what it all is, but it's enlightening. You can look it up. 13 countries attended and recognized that opium use, which was being fueled more now by heroin that was introduced a few years earlier.
Oh, yeah.
So opium use was becoming a problem.
Man, it's funny you're talking about opium. We just watched the story of Ricky, which ends up having a whole plot line about opium.
Oh, yeah.
It's prescient.
Yet they burned the opium. It was agreed that each nation needed to make their own regulations, but they all agreed on a few general directives to varying degrees to prevent opium smoking, ban the export to countries that prohibited importation or where use was illegal, regulate use for non-medical reasons, and control the manufacture of medicines that used opium.
So mostly opium focused on that one?
Yeah. That was the Shanghai Opium Convention.
That makes sense.
In the U.S., it became illegal to import opium unless for medicinal use, and the American delegates to the Shanghai Convention secured the approval of President Taft for whatever they wanted to do.
Yeah, to back whatever they
but
decided
there also wasn't a bureau of anything, so like it was just they're just coming to these conventions and they're like, okay, I guess we'll do that, but so the same 13 nations gathered again in 1912 for the Hague Opium Convention. The regulations and principles that came from this convention are still the basis for international drug control to this day. So the Hague limited any narcotics trafficking except for cannabis. Cannabis wasn't included. This trafficking agreement didn't make the drugs illegal, but it made countries responsible for control over the substances, including preparation, manufacture, and use. So they created a tracking system to find out where and how much are being produced and shipped.
So actually paying attention to stuff for once.
Yeah. 2 years later, the U.S. passed the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914, which developed a record-keeping process for selling opiates and cocaine. It also didn't make anything illegal again yet, but enforced the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. So now they're like, now you really need to label your active
we'll
ingredients.
wag our fingers at you if you don't follow this.
You need to do that, see? And reduced access to like the medicines and ingredients. So 1 year later, there were 1,078 medicines, and 52 had opiates, 5 had cannabis, and none had cocaine. So they reduced some a little bit.
Take that, cocaine.
But also 1,078 and only 52 had opiates. What was in the other
twigs and
800
rocks
or 900 and something?
Salt.
Pea. Bear pea or something, didn't they? I mean, they're everything.
Yeah.
Everything. So 16 years later, in 1930, was when the U.S. decided how to really control narcotics with the appointment of Harry Anslinger to run the Federal Narcotics Bureau, a.k.a. the FBN.
Yay.
So he was the original guy in charge of everything. So when the Harrison Narcotic Act was passed, that was directly before World War I, and Harry was in his 20s at the time. He decided to join the army, but he had vision issues, and he couldn't fight, so he was appointed as the assistant to the Chief of Inspection of Equipment. And as he always did before with his previous jobs, due to his ambition and diligence, he rose quickly in the ranks to second lieutenant in the Ordnance Reserve Corps, which is a sustainment branch of the Army, and that supplies Army combat unions with weapons and ammunition. So it's basically like
their resupply and
their holding point. And then he was promoted to U.S. diplomat stationed at The Hague in the Netherlands. So yeah, he was known, like he had ambition and drive. Like he was a go-get-em. Like when he was younger,
and he knew how to kiss up.
I don't know.
You always have to know how to kiss up.
Yeah, he does, and like to manipulate people. And so, like when he was younger, he worked for the railroads, and even though he didn't really have an education, he like rose up, and he was a supervisor, and he went to college without graduating from high school. So like it
cost him $3 a year.
Yeah, he just really wanted to better himself from the beginning. So like the introduction circle concludes, like, now we're at The Hague again. It really doesn't tie in together, but we're here.
Yep.
He's fluent in German and Dutch and is proficient in French, and he is often sent out as an intelligence agent where he mingles with royalty, world leaders, ministers, and the high classes.
Oh, hello, Mr. Anslinger. How are you?
So he developed his skills of deception and to gather information for the United States. From The Hague, he is sent to Hamburg. Like how you're better at accents than
Hamburg. Where he came up with his delicious sandwich idea, and that's actually what most of this podcast is going to be about.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We'll continue on with that.
I figured this one out early.
You love hamburgers, so that's why I picked it.
I mean, I'm a human being. Most of us do.
So he is sent to Hamburg as the American vice consul, and here he is discharging American soldiers. He notices that increasing amounts of the soldiers are addicted to morphine, opium, and heroin. And as we said, heroin was kind of like the new drug. Yeah, that was available in the U.S. in the late 1800s.
Black tar?
I think that was another thing that came out of Germany. They're
goddamn Germans. I mean, I love the German people.
Advanced in pharmaceuticals, so.
It was probably Bayer.
And after that, he is stationed in Venezuela and the Bahamas, and he is working on the regulation of alcohol into the U.S. during Prohibition. So he was like the first, he was the assistant commissioner of Prohibition.
That sounds like a real square.
Yeah, and like alcohol is definitely a drug.
Oh, yeah.
I know we are so...
it's so ingrained in human history.
Yeah, that it's like... Grained.
Yeah.
So it's like we're so accustomed to being like just alcohol, but
it's just built into so many cultures.
Yeah.
It's impossible to get rid of it.
Right, but it's definitely a drug, and it's one of the most powerful drugs in the world too. It's really bad. So while he is in these outside of the United States, he's using negotiation skills to pursue treaties that push alcohol prohibition in other European countries and their colonies, like the Bahamas.
I can't imagine that went over well.
Yeah. And his primary attitude while he's working on tracking down rum runners and, people who are...
Captain Jack Sparrow?
He believes in maximum force to persecute people.
Oh, he sounds American.
Right. So this will be his MO for the rest of his working life. Like, in his view, strict enforcement of the law was the only proper response to illegal drug use, and he urged judges to jail offenders, then throw away the key. So it's like...
It's because so many people in power in the American government and prison system always wanted to be punitive and not rehabilitative.
They just feel like, well, if we get them off the street, then we've solved the problem.
Yeah, we get them off. We give them such a horrible life that they can never, ever go back to civilization, so to speak, and so they just get just stick them in jail forever.
Not recognizing the cycle that imprisoning people doesn't solve the problem, because imprisoning just adds to the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because people, not everybody can just be rich. So in 1929, he's hired as the assistant commissioner of prohibition, as we stated, but now we're back on our years. And he's overseeing the Narcotics Control Board. And it becomes clear that prohibition won't last. And in 1930, he's appointed by President Hoover, our favorite president.
Old Herbert.
As the commissioner of narcotics and chief of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Which
the FIBN.
The FIBN, which is the precursor to the FDA, as we talked about in the first episode.
The FIDA.
Yeah. Through the early years, Harry was constantly having to prove his and the Bureau's worth. And contrary to what we have today, the FBN was operating on a small budget, and not everyone thought it was useful.
I promise you, I'm more than just an ass licker. I'm also a really good drug controlling man.
Controller guy. So he was constantly, in fear that the FBN would be shut down. And so he did keep a low budget on purpose, because the departments with high budgets were more scrutinized. So he made up the difference with seized assets.
Oh, those are all those are in vogue right now.
Yeah, as law enforcement agencies do today, like auction off property taken from
just
drug
take people's
dealers.
Cash when they see it and say, this is a civil forfeiture, and boom, eat my butt. Or, as we call it, take an ass liquor.
Mm-hmm. And in the early 1930s, there was the Chinese mafia, which is known as the Tongs. And they controlled nearly all of the opium distribution in the United States. And they ran all sorts of illegal operations, including opium dens in Pennsylvania Avenue.
Oh.
So, can you imagine just Washington, D.C. with, just opium dens everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, after what, that brilliant guy Madison Cawthorn was talking about with their coke parties and whatnot still nowadays, I bet you there's a lot of drug use in Washington.
It's hard to... You just don't really hear about that, how big of a problem opium dens were. You hear about it in other countries, but you don't really think about it as United States, at least.
Well, I watched Deadwood, so I know how big a problem opium dens are.
Yeah, I didn't really stick out to me a lot, studying history throughout the years. I didn't really study a lot about drugs, though. It wasn't at the top of my list, but...
what if they were pink unicorn drugs?
You always think that I like unicorns so much, but...
I'm sorry. Rainbow kitty cat drugs.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I like rainbows and sparkles, but if they were drugs, then I might not like them anymore. So from the beginning of the FBN, Anslinger had his eye on the opium dens on Pennsylvania Avenue. And it wasn't only because of the drug trafficking, but also because he was observing a lot of young white girls getting into trouble around the dens. Save the white girls.
Mm-hmm.
And they were being tricked with the promise of jobs. This was the beginning of the Great Depression, so the promise of a job was enticing.
They just left. They said the first part really quiet. Jobs.
So this was the Tongs hiring process. So the men would call over the girls, telling them they had jobs for them. Then they'd convince them to smoke opium, and then give them hard candies laced with sexual stimulants.
Oh.
Like horny goat weed. Like ancient Chinese herbal stimulants.
Spanish fly.
Yeah, it's just stuff like that. I hope that's not like racist, but anyway. The dens were kept hot so that they'd take their clothes off. And then when the opium wore off, they were given a capsule of heroin to lift their mood. So like when you first start taking heroin, it's like an upper. Like it gives people energy and makes them feel good. So they would give them that. And then usually they would come back for more after the heroin wore off.
Got that first taste in, huh, girls?
And then they were given some free capsules, and then they weren't. And since they couldn't pay, they were offered the actual job as a sex worker, or they could recruit other girls to be sex workers.
It's a drug sex pyramid scheme.
Yeah. So you or your friend, which one? Which one is going to be? Anyway, so Anslinger hates the opium dens. So
I'm with him so far on opium
yeah, I mean,
dens.
they're not bad they're not good.
They are bad.
Yes, they are bad.
Don't cancel us.
Don't cancel us. Opium dens are bad. So they are corrupting young white girls with the drug he hates the most, opium, and for two, he's the racist, since these are immigrants, peddlers of his most hated drug, and going after sweet little white girls. As we know, systematic American racism and white women go hand in hand. Can't have one without the other. It's really, that was the fire under the pot. So he needs to bring the opium dens down to save the poor white women. And it is horrible that the women were tricked and trafficked, but what if these women were black or Asian?
I wouldn't be surprised if there were black and Asian and Hispanic.
Yes,
and
there are
others, but he doesn't give
but
it.
He
didn't care until he saw it. Yeah,
he's noticing the white women. But if there weren't white women involved, he wouldn't care as much. Like he'd want to bring them down, but
he'd be annoyed. They'd be a target. They would not be his main. Source
he wouldn't care about those women in particular. So he organized raids of the opium dens with his agents as well as the Metro Police, and he decides to make the raids during the 1 week that the Tongs are in town. All the Tongs are in town for a conference.
A tongference.
A tongference. So I'm like, when I was reading this, I was imagining like the Tongs like setting up in a nice hotel and getting their name tags and schmoozing and having their free continental breakfast.
They've got their little wine glasses and their pinkies out. And
so, they're having a conference. They raid 30 dens in one night. Anslinger tells the, quote unquote mayor of Chinatown that he should be arrested too for letting this go on, and pressures him to forbid the Tongs and the opium dens from the neighborhood. And it actually works. They successfully cleaned the opium dens off the local map and eventually across the country. So he has one worth now proven, but it won't be the last time that he'd have to prove the FBN's worth.
And then we replaced all the opium dens with just doctors' offices.
Pill mills, which they're now cracking down on, which just makes an even bigger problem.
Cracking on the lower parts, but not the actual Sackler family or any of them.
No,
they can keep their money.
Make the addicted people pay. So Anslinger plays up the dangerous world of drugs and how far-reaching and global it is. He wants to target the supply, and the supply being the origin point of the spread of narcotics, which is, the point where the immigrants and minorities are, basically.
I got you.
So let's take a little walk down the value of cannabis lane. So did Anslinger know that that cannabis and marijuana were the same thing? Like, there's no way to know for sure, but I mean, it's possible he didn't know. The cannabis plant is grown in the East, was more hemp-like and used for medicines like asthma medicines, and it actually worked. And so medicines and textiles,
which we finally come back to around after all this time.
Yeah, like it worked really well for asthma and stuff like that. So in the East, it was more hemp for textiles and medicines. And the THC count was so small, it was more like CBD. So like the CBD part comes from hemp, and the cannabis in the West, aka Mexican regions, was cultivated for the flower and higher THC rates. And this was the cannabis that was coming to his attention. So it is most likely that he did know that they were the same thing.
Just didn't give a shit.
Yeah, and he didn't care. The crops in the East were productive for farmers, and the loss of this crop could be devastating for them. However, there were substitutes for hemp products, like Hearst paper and like timber, owning timber plots and whatnot, and DuPont nylon, and cotton and such like that. So there were substitutes.
And agave, so you could make tequila.
Yeah. Yes, the hemp tequila that we all know and love. So, did Anslinger make deals with these people maybe to take down hemp?
Most of the time, you just assume that the United States government is always working with mega corporations of some sort.
But we'll have more on that later.
Oh.
So, as part of his job, he had to have heard multiple sources talking about cannabis and its varying effects. So, he chose not to believe the good and decided that the bad information was what he had to tackle. So, his confirmation bias, really.
Yeah.
So, he was...
Who cares about the medicine? I just want to get the not white people in jail.
Yeah. So, he was hearing how awful marijuana was, and that was the info he was confirming, that marijuana was causing violent crimes. Quote, police officers in Texas claim that marijuana enticed violent crimes, aroused a lust for blood, and gave its users superhuman strength.
It doesn't?
Rumors spread that Mexicans were distributing this killer weed to unsuspecting American school children. End quote.
What? Kids don't have money. Why would they want to give their drugs to kids?
You give it to the kids for free, and then they...
But they still don't have any money.
They use their allowance.
Oh, okay.
Who knows? But the children...
That'd be a good allowance.
The children. So scare tactics work, as we know throughout history. He decided his sources were the correct sources. He wasn't interested in the science. He was interested in the sensationalism and the notoriety he could get for himself, mainly. Even though there was no evidence to support the claims against marijuana, 29 states outlawed marijuana in some form between 1916 and 1931. So it was already being tackled. Just it wasn't like uniform.
Yeah, it wasn't the slam dunk that opium was.
Yeah, and the source wasn't really being regulated. It was just don't have this form of the drug. And as we know, marijuana is the Mexican colloquial name for cannabis sativa. So like just around the world, like different places that is known as, in Africa, it's known as daga, and in China it's called ma, and in Northern Europe it was called hemp. So it's believed that the cannabis originated in Central Asia and has been cultivated for 5,000 years or more. It's a very ancient plant.
And now it's
I think most plants are ancient, but it's one that's been cultivated.
And in more recent history, it's become extremely powerful compared to what people were used to not that long ago.
Yeah, and actually, well, building on that, only one known cannabinoid existed back in the early 20th century, and it was a minor cannabinoid. Like, THC wasn't successfully extracted until 1942. So
by Hitler himself.
Yeah, and 1960... In 1963 was when THC and CBD were isolated and synthesized. So higher doses of cannabinoid were being selectively bred in 1928 for the higher psychoactive form of the cannabis indica, which is Indian hemp, and that's the source of hashish. There's so many different. So there's the cannabis sativa, there's the cannabis indica, and then there's the hemp version. So it's like there's a lot. So there is different variations. So they were selectively breeding the indica, which is where the hashish comes from. And they were breeding for higher levels of THC, but before they knew about THC.
Oh, yeah.
So
they're like, oh, this one really got me messed up. Let's really grow this one.
Yeah. So they were just they were crossbreeding, or, not crossbreeding, but, they were trying to make it stronger and stronger. So, they were, so this strain that they were breeding, you could call it, was first tested in 1928 on a human subject in a controlled setting, but he was giving like 10 times more than like what an edible dose is today. But it's really sciencey. I don't want to confuse myself, but like what they were breeding here that they were testing, it had like 18 to 20% higher levels than it did before. And then they were giving him like 10 times the dose of like what you would give today. So it wasn't great. Like, he didn't have a great high until the end when he felt extremely pleasant. But the test was the source for the way cannabis reacted in a human, the positive and negative. So this was like the source of the, how cannabis reacts.
If we massively overdose you, things aren't that good for a little bit.
But the positive was mainly ignored besides the symptoms of, so like what was not ignored was the symptoms of paranoia, uncontrollable laughter, and urges to talk and not stop. So like this could be the source of the wild person on cannabis, like uncontrollable laughter and uncontrolled talking makes people look crazy, so, but as for the good parts that he experienced, he said that all thoughts of hate and evil left him. All thoughts of hate and evil left him, paranoia, euphoria, and he became extremely hungry, which, good or bad, is good for some people, and tired. He took a long nap and woke up feeling better. That night, he slept well and had no effects the next day, and he exhibited no addiction symptoms. But that was all ignored. Yeah. Because in the beginning, he was paranoid, he was laughing uncontrollably, and he wasn't having a great time. But in the end, it worked out. Like, he didn't have like a hangover or anything like that.
Yeah, because when you go into something looking for a result, you only take in the things that confirm your biases.
Right. So like the experiment was good and bad, but mostly bad was taken from it. So in all reality, it sounds like a great drug, honestly, and like a positive drug. It tackles a lot of health issues, aids the relief of a lot of symptoms that really sick people have, and it doesn't create bad symptoms if taken properly. So according to the podcast I listened to for part of this research, they suggested that if we found the miracle cure for so many things in 1928, then why are we still looking for it? I mean, of course, we don't mean that cannabis cures anything, but it is for sure a better symptom reliever than most of the dangerous as fuck prescriptions on the market now.
Yeah. And it's taken, 100 years now to get back to that a little bit?
Just to, like, getting to the starting point again, really.
Yeah. And if the Supreme Court has their way, I bet you it all ends up going backwards again.
Yeah, I know. So, like, it wasn't until the 90s that they discovered, like, the cannabinoid, like, system and how it works. So, I mean, that could have been discovered back in, like, the 60s when they isolated. But, it's all illegal, so not much you can do with it. In 1994, Lester Grinspoon, an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, believed that marijuana will someday be hailed as a miracle drug, one that is safe, inexpensive, and versatile.
Oh, it won't get to be inexpensive if it's any good. The moment it's good, the price skyrockets.
Yeah, he says, I think that time is now, but the process to federal legalization will still be a long one. Marijuana offenses are so prevalent and lucrative. Basically, I can't see that happening anytime soon. Of course, states will legalize much sooner. So that's what that guy foresaw.
He was correct.
Yep. So, like, we could have prevented the current opiate crisis at that point if cannabis had been continually researched while not being illegal. So, the evil they out there don't want to use natural reliever for whatever. Cause
they have to figure out how they can make the most money from it.
They want to sell you like the 6th FDA approved medicine for this or that.
And then give you the 14 side effects at the end of the commercial that are longer than the actual commercial itself.
Yeah. Then you have to take this other drug to combat those symptoms from the first drug.
Oh, for any of our non-US based audience, just search United States drug commercials on YouTube and you will be wowed at what we allow to air here.
Yeah, I didn't realize that until I was an adult that that other countries are like, why the fuck are there prescription medication commercials in the United States? That's weird. I'm like, that's weird. And then like they're not allowed to pander like that in other countries because it's bad, because you don't want to have somebody walk in like, hey, I saw this on a commercial, can I try this drug? And they're like, sure, because money. So like when you're taking all these medicines to combat all these other symptoms, so like people who are really sick, like where does that stop? Just so Commissioner Harry Anslinger was voted into the board of the Committee on Drug Addiction, the CDA, and that was formed in 1929. The committee made a huge impact on the patenting of pharmaceuticals and, by extension, research. So the committee believed that synthetic chemistry was the future of pharmaceutical research and healthcare. They also wanted to fund research in replacing addictive alkaloids in pharmaceuticals with substitutes that have no addictive properties. Which then would like make morphine pointless, and then they could outlaw morphine and solve the world's opium addiction crisis.
It's because the moment you make something illegal, it completely disappears off the face of the planet.
Yeah. Well, what they thought is good in theory, because like you just said, making drugs illegal doesn't stop the demand or take into account addiction itself. Like we were talking about with pill mills, like closing the pill mills and restricting access to prescription opiates only makes addicted people seek out cheaper alternatives like heroin, which is unregulated and even more dangerous than a prescription. So it doesn't solve anything.
It's the only thing that ever really solves anything is not having it be illegal, but then having really good education and like awareness around the risks that you run if you're doing something.
Yeah. And allowing people who are addicted to safely come off the drugs, which means they still need those drugs. Mm-hmm. They just need to have them administered safely and in a way that can help them break their addiction cycle. But alcohol. So what we're talking about with alkaloid chemistry is the study of all naturally occurring chemicals, and it played an enormous role in the future of pain relief. So cannabis was not a focus of this committee because cannabis is not technically an alkaloid. So alkaloids have to contain nitrogen and cannabis doesn't. So it's much more complex than an alkaloid. So there were extreme limitations on cannabinoid research since the technology at the time didn't have the capacity to isolate complex structures like cannabis. So patenting and not even to mention synthesizing cannabis pharmaceuticals was basically impossible. So, it wasn't simple at all. As we even just trying to describe the plant itself is complex. So it's a complex plant. Pant. So they were focused on opium research for pain relief, not cannabis, since opium is so much easier to work with.
And nowadays we call it copium.
No, we don't.
And hopium.
No,
we
don't.
Oh, I really thought that's what it became.
So the main funders of the CDA were the Rockefeller Foundation, which had a lot of influence behind the scenes. So this non-governmental organization, NGO, also included grants from major pharmaceutical companies that are still active today. And it was the CDA that really created federal drug policies. So in 1930, it was the work of the CDA that cited U.S. government would hold and assign patents on pharmaceuticals.
That doesn't seem ripe for corruption.
Yeah. The CDA decided that when discoveries were patentable, then the National Research Council will pay the patent costs and then become the assignee for the public good.
Sure.
So some members of the board initially disagreed because they felt that that medicine should not be patented because it wasn't in the public interest to do so.
Mm-hmm.
But who cares about that? So the decisions of the committee only added to the opiate crisis that we are experiencing then and now. But as we know, Anslinger really wasn't concerned with the science of narcotics. He used his position on the committee and the FBN to crusade for regulation and control of drugs on a national and international level. Even before Anslinger became Commissioner of Narcotics in 1930, enforcement activities had resulted in an increase in federal prisoners. Surprise.
Boy, what a weird state of affairs to have an increase in prisoners in America.
Who would have thought? In 1929, Congress approved an act to establish narcotic farms,
No.
which
Okay.
that sounds great. So it established the opening of 2 so-called narcotic farms in Lexington and Fort Worth. They would be a prison facility and treatment center for people
Oh.
addicted to habit-forming narcotic drugs.
So guinea pigs.
Yeah. Which, habit forming is opium, coca leaves, and their derivatives, and Indian hemp and peyote, which was the first time hemp and peyote were federally defined as narcotics. Which I'm like, are they even? I didn't even bother because I'm just like, cannabis is not a narcotic. I don't.
It's still one of the worst to get caught with in many places in this country.
Yep. It's just as. Whatever.
You can walk around with a handle of booze you bought for $20, and as long as you don't swig it in public, you're fine.
Right. If you walk around with $20 worth of weed, you can go to jail for 5 years or more. So these farms opened in 1935. They were officially known as U.S. Public Health Service hospitals and would operate the Addiction Research Center. So it was a place to study prison inmates who were drug users and addicts. And here the CDA ran pharmaceutical and addiction research. They tested natural plant derivatives, but mostly new synthetic compounds on the prisoners. So Harry used the research gathered at the narcotic farm to back up his strategies for drug control, which is just a big, circle jerk.
Yep.
Yeah,
So pretty much, and it's instead of cheap prison labor, it's cheap prison
test
guinea
subjects.
pigs. Yeah.
Which I didn't really get that. I didn't really get that deep into it. And I kind of did a little bit, but got rid of it. So basically it's just, they're like, hey, you go to jail for drugs. Now we'll send you to this place to test drugs on you. I'm
guessing there was no choice given it, or was there like an incentive for them to go there?
Nobody really talked about that. I'm sure if I really looked into it, but it was probably a mix of both. They probably were given a choice and probably some were not given a choice. And, there's a gray area probably. All right. So now we have the crusade against marijuana. We're starting that. So before 1934, Anslinger wasn't concerned with cannabis control because he was purely focused on heroin trafficking, and cannabis was taking away from real narcotic problems. So it's always like this tug of war. He's like, oh, I don't care. Oh, I care. It's like... In 1934, the League of Nations Advisory Committee on Trafficking Opium and Other Dangerous Drugs
That's a name.
met in Geneva to discuss the issues of Indian hemp and the abuse of cannabis in the United States. So Indian hemp is the stronger one, kind of, that's like the hashish. So, but everything just gets lumped in as marijuana.
Yeah.
So it's a bad word. So they drew up a full report of all aspects of non-indigenous hemp in the U.S., most commonly known as marijuana. The more interesting aspects of this report is that they claim that most of the U.S. grown hemp was concentrated in areas where, quote, hundreds of Mexicans were employed. And, quote, nearly all of these Mexicans are addicted to smoking marijuana, end quote.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They blame the migrant workers for planting hemp seeds and causing them to spread. And they claim that wherever there was hemp, there would be a large number of Mexican migrant workers. Which really is not true. Because it's a weed. It grows everywhere. But so they blame them for spreading it, though. Like, how dare you spread dandelions? It's your fault. Or sandspurs, as we have in Florida. That's a bad one. The migrant workers are responsible for spreading sandspurs.
Please, nobody just cut out that last line and cancel us.
Yeah, please don't take it out of context. But sandspurs are horrible.
They are pretty terrible.
They don't have them,
I hate them.
Up north, do they?
Nope.
They're horrible. Mm-hmm. I have many painful memories of a child of having sandspurs stuck in my feet and having my parents have to pull them out. It's very traumatizing. So the wording is also poignant because when cannabis is described as useful and medicinal, it's called cannabis sativa. And when it's described as addictive or a problem, it's called marijuana.
Marihuana.
Yeah. The report also states that the importing of cannabis was not a problem at all at the time because it grew like a weed in the United States. People could just gather it if they wanted, but people smoking it and becoming addicted was seen as a growing problem in the youth and in cities. It states that 50% of violent crimes are committed by immigrants and minorities abusing marijuana.
I don't. Seeing as how they are minorities and there's far less of them, it's never made any actual logical sense to think that they are committing the majority of anything.
Right. Because they are not the majority of people.
Yeah.
So northeastern and southern states rarely had legislation against cannabis, and when they did, it was usually fined as misdemeanor or felonies, but they rarely incarcerated people for cannabis. So the states that did incarcerate as a first response are Massachusetts.
Boo. I mean, oh, damn it.
Dang it. Mississippi, Washington, Nebraska, and California. So it's funny how two of those now have completely legalized cannabis. So it was like Massachusetts and California were among the first to make it illegal, and then the first to make it legal again.
Massachusetts likes to waffle between conservative and democratic or progressive leadership, but never too progressive.
Yeah, that was the way Florida used to be until like the 90s.
And Skeletor
it was
took
always
over. And...
it could always go either way, but now it's...
Well, they did put up a crackhead as the last guy to go after baby Hitler. So,
a crackhead to go after baby Hitler? What are you talking about?
Gillum and DeSantis.
No. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was sad what happened to that guy, Gillum. I was like, oh man, I voted for that guy.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he's not a bad guy, but
no, yes.
he really, when he lost the election, he really went downhill.
Yeah.
But anyway, so by the 1930s, the concept of Western medicine was already seen as pharmacological and had moved away from natural and traditional treatments. So the thought process that synthesized pharmaceuticals from a lab are medicine, while plants are drugs.
What?
Yeah. Since cannabis couldn't be synthesized in a lab and studied, it was already left behind as medicinal.
Evil alien drug.
But as marijuana becomes popular with Mexican migrants, jazz musicians, and the lower class, it is seen as a drug again.
We got to get them off the weed and then get them on the heroin so they die young.
Yeah, and actually, Anslinger hated jazz. Can you believe it? He hated jazz, and he kept a special file called Marijuana and Musicians. And as if he couldn't be more of a douche, he planned for months a roundup of popular musicians, but the FBI wasn't able to pull this off because his agents couldn't infiltrate the scene.
Yeah, I imagine that they were sniffing out the G-men pretty obviously.
Yeah, so just moving past the illegalization of marijuana for a minute. So Harry targeted Billie Holiday. She's a target, like 2 out of 3 podcasts now. She's a target. He had an agent follow her when she wouldn't stop talking about racism, and he left her handcuffed on her deathbed because he suspected drug use and possession. And he writes in his biography that he organized a regular supply of morphine for an addicted congressman.
Okay.
And history believes that to be none other than Joseph McCarthy.
Oh.
So it's okay to be an addict if you're white and if you're rich and if you're powerful.
He was busy chasing down the commies, and he needed his morphine to get him through his very difficult days.
It was stressful.
It was stressful being that big a piece of shit.
He needed that calm down a little bit. Okay, so going back to where we were at, Harry enjoyed a lot of public support for his crusades, often counting on people from all types of sectors, private and public, to not only support his views, but to keep him in power. So he was always schmoozing, he's like, I'm
the number one ass slicker.
Yeah, you got to keep me here because I'm working for you. So in return, he helps them with what they want. So it's really hard to know exactly what happened behind the scenes, but here's where most of the conspiracies lie. And I could go into a lot of them, but there's not 100% proof, but there's just speculation. So
that's why they're fun conspiracies.
Yeah. So here's some speculations. Because as I said in the beginning, he wasn't concerned with cannabis. He didn't want to get involved with the Proprietary Association, which was a lobbying group for domestic pharmaceutical grade cannabis growers. And they were backed by pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly and Squibb, which now is Bristol Myers Squibb, but back then it was just Squibb. And other,
It was the Argus Filch Company.
yeah.
That's a really dorky Harry Potter joke.
Yeah, the bad, the bad ones. But I mean, they did lobby because it was, it was medicinal.
Mm-hmm.
So they successfully kept cannabis out of the previous act to list cannabis as narcotic. That was the 1914 one. So they kept it out of that. And they fought against any attempt to close down the cannabis industry and start regulation. But as we started labeling cannabis as marijuana, things changed. So
now it's got a Mexican name, so we got to go after it.
yeah. So Harry starts at the state level and quickly propels anti-marijuana sentiment into a national movement through mass media. So he relied heavily on the mass media to shape the public opinion on drugs. One of Anslinger's biggest supporters was the media magnate William Randolph Hearst.
Ah, history's greatest villain.
Yeah. He relied on Hearst's yellow journalism, which is historical clickbait, historical clickbait and fake news, and propaganda for public support. His publications would include cartoons and articles that supported the FBN's actions. One target demographic for this was middle-class white mothers.
Ah, yes. Christ, what the hell's her name? Flanders' wife in The Simpsons is what I always think of for that. Maud. That's her name. Maud Flanders.
Maud Flanders. Yeah, they look so nice and sweet on the outside. But white mothers in history, well, in United States history in the mid-century, so the white mothers would fear their children getting caught up with drug users, especially Hispanic or black. These publications are also the source of Anslinger's racist quotes, and although the claims are that he was actually reading quotes from other people, he was still quoting them. It was obviously what he and the FBN believed. He was almost fired once for using racist slurs, so he was actually forbidden to use racist language from then on. So, which is funny because it's like there was actually conservatives who were like, he needs to step down because he's being extra racist for being racist at the time.
You need to be
He's
smart
too racist.
and not be so open about it. We hide it, man.
Yeah. So he couldn't use the language as openly as he did before. So he just developed policies that attacked minorities disproportionately. He just got them where it hurt.
That is what almost every awful conservative jurisdiction and plenty of awful liberal ones do now. Well, not liberal. Yeah, liberal. Not leftist. Liberal. It is a big difference.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that is the main thing. I mean, especially the gerrymandering and so many different things that are going on just here in Florida, where they are enacting every policy they can aimed at giving their minority a majority of the influence.
Right. And then when people try to change it and give traditional, like, black communities back their voting lines, are like, you're gerrymandering, and then they're like, you can't do that. It's like, you do it all the time. So these articles were also the source of wild claims like using marijuana intravenously, people becoming like the living dead, people becoming psychopathic murderers, or causing kids to have orgy parties.
How's that seen? That's a negative?
Yeah. It's funny now, but back then people actually feared things like that were really happening. So, yellow journalism.
Well, they weren't that off from syphilis being so widespread and essentially seeing human zombies.
Yeah. There are some grains of truth in these wild claims that we still believe today, like marijuana is the gateway to other drug use. That was one of their big claims.
And it's like any drug can be that, because once you start getting into something that's really mood altering, then you can be like, oh, some people might go, oh, I like this one, maybe I like that one too. It's not. So
basically any drug you try the first time
it's
will
not
be
a
the
specific thing. I never drank alcohol, and then I tried a hard cider, and I was like, damn, this is pretty good. I wonder if any other drinks are good. Thankfully, I don't have a predilection for alcoholism in my family, so.
Yeah, luckily. So you can enjoy a nice drink for the flavor and not doing it just to get drunk. So with this campaign, drugs became a scapegoat. Like all drugs and drug users are lumped into one category, delinquent drug user.
Scum.
And then they can be the scapegoat for a lot of problems America was facing, like poverty, racism, mental health, addiction, as a health crisis, etc. So it can be just drugs that cause all these issues, and the drugs can be the source of the problem. Like, Americans and America are great, except for the druggy psychopaths. That's the real problem.
Goddamn hippies.
The cause of everything. So Hearst is considered one of the main influencers against particularly cannabis.
He was like the Charlie D'Amelio of his day.
Was he?
Yeah. He would have been big on TikTok.
Hearst.
Mm-hmm.
So particularly cannabis, but more specifically hemp. And why hemp, you might be asking.
Why hemp, I'm asking.
Because of his extensive timber holdings.
Oh.
And hemp was an economical replacement for paper pulp in the newspaper industry.
Yeah, I learned that from Woody Harrelson. He's extremely pro-hemp.
Yeah. I mean, it's good. It's a great textile.
It's like a jack of way more trades than you would think.
And there was scientific research that backed up hemp stems were favorable to wood pulp. So imagine how differently things could be today if hemp became the main source for paper rather than timber. Like,
the entire planet would be covered by trees and we'd all be dead.
We could be like...
Hearst saved us.
We could be... Yeah, no.
At least that's what his paper
told me. Death by
me.
trees. Death by oxygen. Like... How much could climate change have been altered if we had used hemp?
Oh, who needs the
paper
Amazon rainforest
instead of trees? Something that grows like a weed rather than things that take hundreds of years to grow, and So
and are also generally really, really tough and dangerous to cut down.
Yeah.
And handle.
Rather than just picking a weed.
And all the gigantic machinery you need to pick it and process it, and all the bad stuff that's put in you.
Yeah.
Oh well.
So this is still like the kind of conspiracy-ish part. Like some people are like, well, Hearst didn't have all these timber holdings and blah blah blah. But either way,
those people are simps.
Paper was what he relied on.
Yeah.
So there were also other investors in DuPont's nylon, including the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon. And the Treasury was the government department that the FBN was under before the FDA was created. So,
that sounds like a modern day Nancy Pelosi who always makes the smartest Wall Street decisions right before they happen.
Yeah.
She's brilliant.
So, your boss has significant investment in nylon. So, he doesn't want hemp to be the next thing. They want nylon to be the next thing. So nylon was another alternative to hemp, although this was denied by DuPont. They listed silk and rayon as their primary rivals from the beginning. It wasn't hemp.
But that's also why DuPont was going around and smushing every silkworm they could find.
Yeah. And, they're not concerned with cannabis like hemp. What's hemp?
Never even heard of it.
So, what do you think then? Like, we already discussed that. So, cannabis is a plant that could provide fiber, oil, food, pulp, plastic. Yes, plastic. Hemp
stick.
There was some researchers that found that they could make plastic from hemp. But forget about that. And medicine. Done. So how many different industries can this plant that's been used for thousands of years shake up? Like
3. Sorry, I'm not good at counting.
So even though hemp can provide all those things and is not intoxicating, it could all be lumped under marijuana. Technically, it was the same plant, and then the whole thing could become dangerous and feared. And also propaganda and sensationalism sells papers.
Yeah, I mean, if one Mexican guy smokes or even just touches hemp, he gets the strength of 400 white men.
Yeah.
And we can't have that. That's very dangerous.
And then he can make his own clothes and paper and plastic.
Oh, no.
And then evil everyman. So Harry used this sensationalism to support the Uniform State Narcotic Drug Act in 1934, and the purpose of the act was to make the law uniform in all the states with respect to controlling the sale and use of narcotic drugs. It was also needed to show the U.S.'s compliance in international treaties they agreed to. So this is still used as an excuse as to why we can't reschedule cannabis from a Schedule 1 drug today, because we can't violate the treaties.
Sure.
But violation is not a problem with other treaties, like those involving climate change. But
Oh, yeah. No, we're just going to drop out of them. Fuck off, Paris Accord.
yeah, so the Uniform State Narcotic Drug Act regulated manufacturing, sales, and use restrictions on cocaine, opium, heroin, and cannabis. It also included a clause that not all the states had to adopt the act. So the Proprietary Association, which we discussed before, they also got involved and did make some progress in thwarting this somewhat. In the beginning, only 9 states initially adopted the act, and from then on, Anslinger goes hard for marijuana, claiming that it caused temporary insanity and puts up a campaign of advertisements that show young people smoking marijuana and then showing them committing crimes, raping, killing others, and committing suicide and dying from marijuana use. And then after this, all the states adopt the act.
Because people are dumb and easily swayed.
Yeah. So, like as we touched on briefly, Harry was gathering evidence of cannabis causing crime and violence and ignored the evidence that provided alternative interpretations, including a discussion forwarded to him by the American Medical Association, in which 29 of 30 pharmacists and drug industry representatives objected to his proposal to ban marijuana. In which one person in particular stated that they had never heard of cannabis's misuse. But that one guy, the one out of 30, that said he had known a doctor who was addicted to marijuana.
Oh.
And then that was the one statement that was
need.
preserved in the FBN's files.
Yep.
So he sought out an increase in reports of people smoking marijuana, and from 1936 to 1937, the reports showed an accelerated pace of use and spread. Before this, smoking of marijuana was pretty much confined to the Southwest along the Mexican border, and its use was relatively slight. So Harry is armed with his Gore files, which is a collection of 200 hand-picked quotes and files from police reports.
Oh, not from Al Gore?
No. Unfortunately.
I mean, that's probably a good thing.
Yeah. He used the Gore files to point out crimes performed by drug users, a.k.a. crimes that could be blamed on cannabis use.
What about all the crimes that happen with people not on drugs?
But that's not what we're talking about.
I mean...
Well, he's specifically talking about these drugs and how they cause all the world's problems and all the problems in the United States.
All right, I'll see what he's selling.
So Harry's favorite piece of evidence was the 1933 case of Victor Licata. And to my surprise, when I was looking this up, I was like, oh, wow, this was in Ybor City, which is right here in Tampa.
Yep.
And then I looked in the murders occurred on October 16th.
Oh, hey.
So that's my birthday. So I was like, wow,
Happy Murder Day.
That hit a little hard. I was like, wasn't expecting to have 2 things like that.
Did this murder have anything to do with a delicious Cuban sub?
No, I mean, unless he was hungry from all the cannabis he was
That's
smoking.
what I always think of when Ybor is mentioned.
Yeah. Which the Cuban sub with salami, which is superior, by the way, fight me. So he killed 5 of his family members, and in the mass media, these murders were explained as the work of a marijuana addict and used to prove the link between recreational drug use and crime. Police and the press made the claims that he was addicted to marijuana. 2 days after the murders, the chief of the Tampa Police Department downplayed the role of cannabis, but emphasized that marijuana should still be prohibited. He said, quote, maybe the weed only had a small indirect part in the alleged insanity of the youth, but I'm declaring now and for all time that the increasing use of this narcotic must be stopped and will be stopped. How can you say those 2 sentences together?
I mean, you're an idiot.
Yeah. And cannabis was never mentioned in any of Licata's psychiatric reports and was not considered a factor in the murders. And he obviously had a pre-existing history of mental illness that had even been recorded by the police department. He was found unfit to stand trial, and he was never prosecuted and was committed to the Florida State Hospital for the insane.
I bet you that place is fun.
I don't think it exists anymore because it was too fun.
Shit.
Harry used this case in particular to prove that marijuana caused insanity, criminality, and in the Licata case, hallucinations or marijuana-induced dreams.
Oh, shit.
Because he was like, oh, the guy lost his sense, like he blacked out because of cannabis and then did these murders.
Everyone looked like a Funyun and he was just trying to get at him and eat him.
Or the Cubans. They all look like Cuban sandwiches.
He was trying to, they were the pieces of a Cuban, and he was trying to make a Cuban out of them. Yeah, he was trying to chop
them up with the axe. And then, oops, the marijuana made me think my family was Cuban sandwiches.
It is hallucinogenic.
So he recounted this story to Congress during the testimony for the Tax Act of 1937.
He wanted to turn his entire family into Cuban subs.
He said that Licata had no recollection of having committed the multiple crime. And the officers knew him ordinarily as sane, which they didn't because they had police reports already about him and his mental health issues. So rather than a quiet young man, now he was pitifully crazed. They sought the reason. The boy said he had been in the habit of smoking something which youthful friends called muggles, which is another name for marijuana. I was like, I wonder if a certain somebody that she who must not be named knew about this. So it's like, so are muggles little marijuanas? Anyway, I was like, muggles, okay, but that was like the only time
It had been a word. I thought muggles was also like a word in certain communities for people that just weren't hip, like they weren't cool.
Yeah, they weren't joints. Yeah, it was, but that was the only thing I came across of it being called muggles. But it must have just maybe it was a local term.
Yeah. The world is pretty big.
Yeah. Education surrounding cannabis was non-existent, so all the population knew was propaganda from mass media outlets and what they published. Also because they knew this is marijuana, not cannabis.
Kind of sounds like Lily and TikTok.
How?
That all they know is from this one big media.
Yeah, everything, news and everything comes from TikTok.
I saw it trending on TikTok.
They're like, oh, Mom, this song from 1990 is trending on TikTok. I'm like,
hit me, baby.
Or they don't necessarily say that. They're like, oh, listen to this song. I'm like, that was a song when I was a teenager and it was popular. And now you hear them on the radio again because of TikTok. At least now it helps the kids learn something about culture.
Yeah, but it's 90s culture. That's best forgotten.
I like 90s culture.
You're
not nostalgic about anything.
Yeah.
You don't experience nostalgia?
Not heavily. It's got to be very specific things.
Yeah, like I do, and then I realize, oh, why do I have nostalgia for that? But you can't escape it. You know, it hits you. That's the point of it. That's what it means. But some people don't have that compassionate, nostalgic gene.
It's not compassion. It's
compassion for the past. Compassion. Like I feel like nostalgia for like eras that I didn't even live in because I just, as a history person, it hits me hard. So returning to this, most media outlets released articles about how marijuana enslaved users caused violent crime and was pushed on children so they would develop a habit and turn to harder drugs. The use of marijuana was portrayed as Mexican, black, or poor in order to rile up the middle and upper class, which in turn would cause a desire for control and imprisonment. It's those poors. They're causing all these problems. But also when poor people are addicted to drugs and have problems, it makes things look so much worse because the consequences are so much more devastating for them. So it makes the drug use look so much. If you're rich and you have a drug problem, it can be taken care of. It's fine because you can take time out of your life. You can afford treatment, but poor people, it hits them so much harder. So it makes it look so much worse. And here we get to the Reefer Madness film, which I'm going to touch on briefly because it's just so ridiculous. But
it was a funny riff tracks.
Yeah, I actually don't think I watched it all because it was just so absurd. Or maybe I wasn't watching the right one. There's a bunch of them. Like, but it was originally called Tell Your Children, and by other names around the country, it was like funded by a church or something. But it was about marijuana being pushed on school children and two adults that hold reefer parties.
But it was weird. They literally just push the leaves on kids. They don't actually know how it works.
Yeah, like they did the
they smushed it in their face.
They did like the face off where they're like shh and rubbed it down their face.
Didn't do anything.
Yeah, so they give the high school students reefer and cause their lives to spiral out of control, leading them to being involved in a rape and murder trial. And this film caused panic. Since the drug was referred to as reefer or marijuana, they didn't know that the drug in the spotlight was actually the medicinal cannabis. So they simply thought marijuana was a new drug for migrant workers and caused insanity and a gateway to other drugs. And Anslinger himself published articles that blatantly contained racist themes to the point that, like I said, contemporary politicians demanded that he resign because of his openly racist statements. And some of his evidence included black students partying with white women, white women students smoking marijuana and getting them pregnant. 2 black men kidnapping a 14-year-old girl and keeping her under the influence of hemp and then giving her an STD. In one article he wrote called Assassin of Youth, he wrote about a young teenager who got mixed up in marijuana and jumped to her death from her apartment. It was called a murder by marijuana. And he also wrote about the Licata murders and 2 separate teenage boys who were involved in armed robberies.
And he also wrote about the ricotta murders, which were delicious.
Murder by
lasagna.
Oh, ricotta and cannoli.
Mm-hmm.
So he calls marijuana a cruel attack on the youth, and that its unknown potency overwhelmingly stimulates the immature brain, which isn't entirely false. Like, there are studies that show THC having a negative impact on immature brains, but was marijuana the cause of the violence? Like, it was a factor in the crime, but it wasn't the cause of the crime.
You know what's kind of crazy is if you just replace marijuana with alcohol, you get way, way, way more violent crimes that happen because of it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's fine.
And also, it wouldn't be like cruel attack on the youth, alcohol, which probably was way more of a problem than... Which was way more of a problem than
and
marijuana.
we know there is an actual direct link between alcohol and mood changes and
and damaging the brain.
Yeah,
way more than THC. I mean, they say THC can affect the growing
obliterating
brain, but
your liver.
Not going to be anything like alcohol's effect on the brain. So now we get to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. There's no J; it's actually an H because
marijuana.
This is English America. And we don't respect people's languages. We butcher them. So it's marijuana. Marijuana. You can't tell the difference between the H and the J. But anyway, it's spelled with an H. So
you don't say the J in Spanish.
Marijuana.
Like
Marijuana. Well, it's actually an H instead of a J.
Ah.
They use the phonetic spelling. So they actually spelled it marijuana with an H.
Oh, okay.
So we know for sure...
Marijuana.
Juana. The marijuana.
That marijuana.
We know for sure that Harry wanted to keep the evils of marijuana in the public's eye so that he could continue to garner support to enforce his narcotics regulation and remain important and useful domestically and internationally. So
I want to stay in the spotlight, see?
His preferred method of control was from the source. So he wanted to regulate where the drugs came from. In this case, the plant itself.
We're going to burn every weed in the Southwest America.
And all the hate and evil will leave their hearts. And then that will be a problem. So like this mentality supports the synthesized pharmaceuticals are medicines and plants are drugs. So you can't regulate how a natural plant is being distributed without controlling the source. So source control is that if you control how much is coming from the plant or being distributed from the plant, then you can stop some portion of it going to the black market. So let's get a little bit rather than a lot, or not. So the fault in this plan is that it doesn't address the issue of addiction at all, and it forces the drug trade to go even further underground. So he chooses to stigmatize people with addiction rather than try and find a way to help them. So he certainly didn't see addiction as a public health concern, and he dismisses treatment clinics as morphine feeding stations and bar rooms for addicts.
Despite the fact that he's in the middle of giving a congressman morphine treatments.
Right. Yeah, are you the bar room for this guy? You his feeding station? And even though they are shitty views, his views on addiction is pretty much in line with most of Americans at the time. And addiction is seen as the fault of the person rather than a mental illness. So the result of everything he did, demonizing, campaigning, comes to kind of an anticlimactic end, but it served exactly the purpose that Anslinger and his conspirators wanted. And in 1936, notifications were sent out to pharmaceutical companies asking them what they needed to do to stop them from opposing this bill. So when the bill was introduced, the Proprietary Association didn't show up this time. Mm-hmm. And in 1938, all those companies were granted opium importation permits.
Wow.
And that was a
what
trade-off.
What bribe do you need?
Yeah. So they're like, I guess opium, please. So win-win. So the Proprietary Association just turned their backs on the medical cannabis. So in 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively beginning the process of criminalizing the possession of marijuana throughout the United States. So the law handed over regulation of cannabis to the government and imposed a schedule of exorbitant taxes and restrictions to, now I'm going to quote some of the law, so restrictions to every person who imports, manufactures, produces, compounds, sells, deals in, dispenses, prescribes, administers, or gives away marijuana.
You may just give it away.
Yeah, you can't even give it away. The law further claims that, quote, it shall be unlawful for any person required to register and pay the special tax under the provisions of Section 2 to import, manufacture, produce, compound, sell, deal in, dispense, distribute, prescribe, administer, or give away marijuana without having so registered and paid such tax. So basically, it was illegal to do anything regarding marijuana without registering and paying the taxes. And so people weren't going to do this. And so marijuana equals illegal now.
And it completely disappeared off the face of the earth.
Yeah. And, they could just deny people. They'll be like, no, we're not going to let you do that. Or, the regular person can be like, man, I need to give my neighbor this marijuana. I guess I got to go pay the tax. And surprise, surprise, the first person who was arrested by the FBI was a Mexican-American man named Moses Baca.
Called Chewy by his friends.
Yep. So cannabis sativa, and by extension hemp, was put into the most highly regulated drug class and considered as dangerous as heroin and with no medicinal use.
Hey, have you ever seen someone shoot up the pot? It's pretty scary.
I know, it's scary, and the life just goes downhill from there. So it's responsible for millions of incarcerations and nearly completely stopped research into the use of cannabis in medicine and therapy. And the tax law was strongly opposed by the American Medical Association and also the claims of addiction, violence, and overdose. They opposed all of that. Mm-hmm. The AMA claimed the law was written by DuPont lawyers and that they were denied enough legally binding time to oppose the bill. They also claimed that the use of the term marijuana was incorrect and that the medical profession weren't aware that they were losing cannabis. Those DuPont lawyers.
The DuPonts really suck.
Yeah, everywhere.
That whole corporation, throughout all of history, they've been quite a few dollops, and boy.
Yeah. So, and then on the other hand, the hemp industry was completely blindsided. All of their funding disappeared because no one wanted to be associated with marijuana after the Tax Act. And major hemp companies lost all of their financing. They couldn't pay anybody. And one of the corporations, their factory, which was not insured, was burned down the day of their bankruptcy court date. So they literally had nothing. So the whole industry just completely fell under, basically. So, yeah, I mean, after the U.S. made cannabis illegal, many other countries followed. But now many countries have reversed those laws while the U.S. has not. Like Canada is currently enjoying over $600 million in tax revenue from legalizing cannabis. And states with legal cannabis have experienced up to a 20% reduction in opioid use.
It's kind of crazy how, making everything illegal doesn't make it go away. In fact, it just makes it more dangerous to get, but the same people still get it.
Yeah. And so this all just, Anslinger and everybody just created a regulatory process based on incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a great way to keep minorities down, because they're disproportionately attacked for things like this. And
yep.
So another act passed at the height of the McCarthy era, the Boggs Act, our friend McCarthy, who is immune to persecution from doing morphine.
He needed his opium. It's different.
So the Boggs Act issued the same penalties for marijuana and heroin offenses, which is 2 to 5 years in prison for first-time possession. And half of all inmates to this day are in prison for drug charges. So possession charges occur way more frequently than distribution, which is what he wanted to prevent. But they're the easiest to get, possession. So they're not even really focused on distribution because they're like, it's so much easier to get people for possession. Marijuana arrests account for 43% of all drug arrests in the United States, and the U.S. makes 600,000 marijuana arrests on average every year. And if current illegal drugs were legalized and taxed as alcohol and tobacco are, it would be around a $48 billion revenue, rather than the current $55 billion spent on the war on drugs.
We're a very dumb country.
You would think a country that is so obsessed with money would jump all over this. So there would be less to pay for incarceration, but also the corporate prison system would lose half their income.
Mm-hmm.
So, oh no.
Yeah, Rick Scott would be devastated.
Yeah, so, and then also Anslinger's regulation on the source of the drug manufacturer. So the plant itself and its derivatives only created an outlet for pharmaceutical alternatives to naturally grown narcotic ingredients. So the regulation transferred the supply over to even more potent synthetic drugs that you can get legally with a prescription, or when they hit the black market and people demand stronger drugs. So it's like it just makes an outlet for...
Yeah. It doesn't solve a problem, it just makes more.
Yeah. So regulating supply does not help since there's still demand. So, like, remember Economics 101, reduce the supply and you only increase the demand. So the root problem is addiction. Not...
Nope. We only treat the symptoms. We don't treat the cause.
Yeah. So addicts are the ones being taken advantage of. They're the source of income. So... Yeah.
Yay.
Like, I had some more written, but basically we covered it all. You think that a country so obsessed with money would jump all over this, but there's so many different economic factors, like the corporate prison system, the way, like we said, all of these regulations are how we're still running drug control to this day. And it's antiquated.
Pretty much it comes down to, when does it finally become palatable enough to the masses that corporations would be like, okay, we'll now make money on this?
Yeah. What's the tipping point? They basically have to... It basically comes down to, like you said, corporations being like, oh, well, we like a piece of this. And then everything will change. It'll just...
It's like, why have electric cars come back in vogue? It's not because Tesla made a great one. They made really shitty cars. It's just because people want them. The demand is there, and so now they'll finally... do the supply. And it's like, people want drugs for various reasons. it's just not going to disappear. There's always going to be that supply as long as people want it.
Yeah, and it just makes everything worse.
Yeah, you make it a much more difficult, more dangerous situation.
Yeah, you make it harder to get. You make it more dangerous. Like fentanyl and car fentanyl now. And I was like, well, if you could get it that strong, then why would it be so cheap to put into these things? But it just is super cheap from China, and it's just cheaper for them to get that than it is to process the heroin. I don't know, and I'm just like, it's just really shitty. And states that have legalized cannabis, it says opiate use is down by 20%. Like it helps. It's a good thing, and you can get not cures. You can get symptom relief without THC. So I don't know.
Yep, it sucks.
It's sad.
People suck.
It's just
Government
sad
sucks.
how much corporations control our entire lives all the time. I hate it. We're a corporatocracy. We're not a democracy.
Yes. Well, thank you, honey.
You're welcome.
This
one went a little long, but it's so complex.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are still so many things we
didn't even touch upon.
Kind of glossed over.
There's just so much more. It's just everything I came across. I'm like, I can't leave this out. It's important. Yeah. So you do the spiel. You're better at that.
Thank you, everyone who listened. This is, of course, Deceptive Methods with Jesse and Amanda. Amanda doing all the work and me just sitting here going, Jesus Christ, I hate people. As I listen to the story, you can follow us on YouTube at youtube.com and search Deceptive Methods. We're on Anchor. I've got all the links up on the Anchor FM, depending on wherever you watch or listen to this. Thank you so much. We're on Twitter at twitter.com/Deceptive Methods, and we try to do this roughly once a month.
Once a month, release.
Yeah.
This
is only episode 3. It's been going real well so far, and we will see you guys next time. Bye.
Bye. There were so many sources for this episode, so if you want to see them all, just check out Anchor or YouTube where we'll have them all listed.